Once upon a time, a small boy slew a giant and saved his people. The Bible says he went on to conquer Jerusalem and give the wandering Israelites a home. His son Solomon the Wise built them a temple, put the Ark of the Covenant in it, and filled their coffers with wealth. David and Solomon made Israel a nation. Were they historical figures or mere legends? After 3,000 years, can any trace of these biblical giants survive? From Israel to Egypt, from Syria to Jordan, follow the intriguing trail of evidence in search of the lost kings of Israel. It's a story familiar to most of us. The ultimate saga of the underdog. 3,000 years ago, in the dusty valley of Gath, the inexperienced army of the Israelites stood face to face against the mighty Philistine army. For hundreds of years, the story of the Israelites had been one of sorrow and wandering, slavery and flight into wilderness. But that was about to change. The battle-hardened Philistine warriors were ready to wreak havoc. Their 10-foot champion, Goliath, called for a single combat to decide the battle. No one dared step forward, until a young boy took up his slingshot, a stone, and his courage, and fired. He stunned the giant. And when Goliath fell to the ground, David triumphantly cut off Goliath's head with his own sword. It was David who went on to conquer Jerusalem and give the Jews a home at last. 200 years of wandering and fighting since the Exodus were over. According to the Bible, his son Solomon was no less extraordinary. He famously showed his wisdom when two mothers appeared before him, each claiming the same baby as hers. Solomon ordered a knife to be pointed at the baby. One of the women pleaded with him to spare the child, even if the other got the baby. Solomon judged her to be the real mother. He strengthened his father's kingdom, built the legendary temple, and made it the centerpiece of the Jewish religion. Without David and Solomon, there would be no Jewish land.
David and Solomon are very important figures in Israelite history, especially David. He plays such an important role in the later traditions of Judah and Israel, and much later even Christian traditions.
David is revered not just by the Jewish people. Jesus traces himself back to King David through his mother Mary, and Muslims revere David and Solomon as holy prophets. The legends of David and Solomon run like golden threads through the texts of three monotheistic religions. So the question of whether they lived or not is no small matter to millions of people today. Skeptics have dismissed the stories as just that, stories. To begin an investigation into the reality of David and Solomon, one first has to know when exactly they might have lived. Fortunately, on this matter, there is a great deal of scholarly consensus.
If David and Solomon existed, it would have been in the 10th century BCE. This is something that every scholar agrees upon. Everything else they argue about. But when they lived, if they lived, it would have been the 10th century BCE.
Archaeologists have been digging for more than 100 years in Jerusalem, searching for any solid evidence from the 10th century, however small, that David and Solomon actually existed.
When we are asked, we archaeologists, what have we found from the 10th century BC, that is the days of David and Solomon in Jerusalem, have to be honest, very, very little.
But lack of physical evidence is not proof that David and Solomon were merely mythological figures. One of the reasons why archaeologists have come up empty-handed is because this ancient city is the epicenter of one of the world's most brutal and long-standing land disputes. Any quest to seek out the past gets caught up in the politics of the present. But that's not the only problem. Jerusalem is one of the cradles of civilization, continuously occupied for thousands of years, raised and rebuilt many times. Can we really expect to find any clues to David and Solomon in a city that has had so many makeovers since their time? There is one place in this amazing city that has been relatively untouched, and it is underground. Here in the oldest part of the city, known as the City of David, archaeologist Ronnie Reich may have found an intriguing confirmation of a biblical story of David. According to the book of Samuel, David used an ancient tunnel or gutter system to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, which was ruled by his enemies, the Jebusites.
And David said on that day, "Whosoever getteth up to the gutter, and smiteth the Jebusites, he shall be chief and captain."
If indeed David has captured Jerusalem as the Old Testament tells us, then there was a huge fortification for him to overcome. And there were underground rock-cut tunnels which he could take advantage of and find himself into the city in a clandestine way and capture it by surprise.
But until recently, the only tunnel archaeologists had found was from a much later period.
That you see here coming out from the rock from below me are the waters of the spring Gihon, of the biblical spring Gihon. Today it flows into that tunnel, which is Hezekiah's tunnel, 800 BC.
800 BC, too recent, as was King Hezekiah, a descendant of King David who built this tunnel to channel water into the city. For decades, archaeologists knew only of this tunnel, but Ronnie Reich recently discovered a more ancient tunnel not far from here. The find caught the attention of archaeologists and biblical scholars.
You can see it's a rock cut by man from surface down and covered with huge boulders. This is 800 BC, whereas this one is 1800 BC.
Shards of pottery found among these huge boulders helped Ronnie establish that this tunnel dated to around 1800 BC. So it existed here well before David. Could this be the tunnel that David used to capture Jerusalem and make it his capital?
The biblical story tells us how David captured the city, but we're not exactly sure what exactly went on. The word that is used may be described as a water tunnel. It could also be a grappling hook. It could also be a scaling ladder. We really don't know the situation. If we know the meaning of the ancient Hebrew word, and if Ronnie Reich has discovered the proper set of tunnels, then we might be able to say that the Hebrew biblical account is correct. But there are so many ifs involved that we really don't know what we can and can't say.
The search for David in his own city has revealed a tunnel that might tell us of his clever tactics, but little else about David himself. It turns out that the best evidence we have for David comes not from his city or his people, but from his arch enemies. David, the Bible says, was a superb military ruler. After establishing his kingdom with its capital in Jerusalem, David led the Israelites from one victory to another in battles against his mighty neighbors, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites, and the Arameans. With this conquered land, he established the Davidic Empire that extended over both sides of the Jordan River as far as the Mediterranean Sea, paving the way for his son Solomon to inherit a strong empire in which for the first time it was safe to build the Holy Temple and finally house the holiest of holy relics, the Ark of the Covenant. And the greatest testament to David's importance, and as yet the most tangible clue that David was a real human made of flesh and blood, comes from an enemy king who records a victory over David's descendants on a piece of stone called the Tel Dan Stela.
The Tel Dan Stela is a monumental stone inscription incised with letters. It is written in Aramaic, put up by an Aramaic king who claims that he has conquered 70 cities. And he is setting up this particular stela to commemorate this occasion.
One of the conquests, he claims, shook biblical archaeology to its core.
The 6 letters say Bet David. There's the Bet and the Yud, the Taf, the Dalet, the Vav, and then again the Dalet, Bet David.
These words, Bet David, when translated into English, read House of David. This is the first time the House of David, or even the name David, has been found on a non-biblical source. For all those who'd been searching for evidence of David's existence, these 6 letters were the ultimate find. It was clear that David was no mere tribal leader. He was the founder of a nation that lived on long after his own death.
The discovery of the Tel Dan Stela in 1993 and 1994 was probably the single most important discovery related to David that's ever been found, because it's the first mention of David or the House of David outside the Bible that we've got. It shows that David or a House of David did exist.
So perhaps, as the Bible says, David was a great king who led his people to victory in battle, making his kingdom both large and great. Great enough that his descendants attracted the attention of an enemy king. More fragments of David's story can be put together from evidence left behind by his other enemies. And the Philistines, one of his biggest rivals, are proving to be a rich cache of information. In fact, David's first victory, even before he became king, was against the Philistine giant, Goliath of Gath. Based on both archaeological evidence and historical sources, archaeologists like Aaron Meyer have determined that this mound is the remains of the city of Gath.
We're now standing on Tel Safi, which is a large ancient mound which is identified as Gath of the Philistine.
Gath was one of the biggest of the Philistine cities, and the Bible mentions it specifically. To have found Gath is a huge boost for archaeologists looking for evidence of biblical stories from the time of David, the 10th century BC.
We have very, very impressive evidence of the Philistine Gath from the 12th, 11th, 10th, and 9th century. Then there is a very substantial destruction level in which the entire city is destroyed.
Although David is not credited with the destruction of the city, the Bible simply stops mentioning Gath around this time. Archaeologists previously had no explanation for why Gath had dropped off the biblical radar screen, but now they know. Gath was no longer mentioned because it no longer existed. A Philistine city destroyed at the time of David's conquests, hometown of Goliath. Is this the proof that David existed? It's not enough for some archaeologists.
Since we found the cities, including Gath, maybe we could argue that David existed as well. Alternatively, one could take the opposing view that the people writing the Bible knew the historical context, were able to write the story with convincing details, and simply place David into the story. There's no way to tell which is correct.
But another one of King David's famous enemies can offer more tangible clues. The Bible tells us that the kingdom of Israel spread under the control of David and his army. And one of his major military victories was over the powerful kingdom of Edom.
And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all of Edom he put garrisons. And all they of Edom became David's servants. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went.
Until recently, there was no evidence that the Edomites were anything but a band of nomads. And it was thought that biblical writers merely exaggerated their stature to magnify the greatness of David's victory over them. But some believe all that changed when Jordanian archaeologist Dr. Mohammed Najjar and his colleagues started research on ancient copper-producing societies in the deserts of Jordan, formerly the lands of Edom. They stumbled on evidence that the Edomites may indeed have been a power to be reckoned with.
These slag things here, we call them slags. Slags are mainly the waste product of copper production.
From ancient times up until now, the only way to refine copper has been to heat mined copper ore in furnaces. All that's left after the copper is extracted are these worthless black rocks. But they are an important clue to archaeologists. Judging by the amount of this black mineral dotted around the area, Najjar and his team realized that this kind of copper production must have been part of a centrally organized society. A bird's-eye view of the walls confirms what the copper signifies. The signature outline of a large building, or as Dr. Najjar says, a large fortress. In fact, it's one of the largest Iron Age fortresses found anywhere in the region of Jordan, Israel, and Sinai. That means that Edomite society was probably not nomadic, as was previously thought. It may have been a highly advanced and centralized society, one that could well have attracted the destructive attention of someone like King David. Radiocarbon dating shows that they may have thrived at the right time.
We proved that the Edomites existed. They were here in the 12th, 11th, 10th century and 9th century. And if this is true archaeologically, if this is scientifically proven, maybe that was true, that David was fighting with the Edomites in the area.
But if David left his mark on Edom, we have yet to find it. As Dr. Najjar and his team continue to excavate here, maybe something in this rubble will shake the world of biblical archaeology and provide that proverbial smoking gun of David's true power. From the adult King David, conqueror of Jerusalem, our search for clues leads us back to the young David and his most famous single act.
Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span.
6 cubits and a span is around 3 meters tall. A terrifying sight to the young David. We all know what happened next. David answered Goliath's challenge and slew the giant with nothing but a slingshot. For centuries, the story of a puny boy who stood up to a bully has captivated us. To believers, it's a true story of courage, determination, and faith in God. To skeptics, it's merely a fable. And certainly, of all David's exploits, this one has the ring of a myth. So no one was expecting to find evidence of Goliath. But then a tiny piece of baked clay showed up that amazed everyone, archaeologists and biblical scholars alike.
I'm holding here the sherd, the Iron Age sherd from the 10th century BCE, which was found at Tel Safi in 2005.
Written in the language of the early Philistines, the word etched out here would be pronounced Aulatis.
Once that very name was moved and heard by a Semite, they changed the pronunciation. So instead of Aul, they pronounced Gol.
To the Hebrew ear, Aulatis would have sounded like Golatis, and then been further transformed into Goliath. Does that mean that this potsherd belonged to Goliath? The Goliath of the Bible? It probably didn't belong to Goliath himself, because the shard dates to a time period slightly after he was supposed to have lived. But what it does tell archaeologists is that there were Philistines in Gath around and after the time of David, and at least one of them called himself Goliath.
We have here a very nice example in which we can show that in 10th century Philistine Gath, the people who lived there, the Philistines, used names similar to the name Goliath. I think we can extrapolate from that the biblical text describing David and Goliath seems to retain a very, very strong historical kernel of the early Philistine cultural realia. That means that this story is based on real events, real people, real historical background.
But for some scholars, there's an awful lot that's wrong about the Goliath of the Bible.
We cannot read this story as really a simplistic historical testimony for David in the 10th century BC. Take the armor of Goliath in the story, described in details.
He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had greaves of bronze upon his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron.
It turns out that the clothes Goliath is described as wearing are anachronistic. They didn't exist at the time. Neighboring Egyptians had encountered the Philistines as well, and their records show the Philistines in what are now considered more accurate clothes for the time. Egyptologist Ted Brock helps us interpret a battle scene engraving that shows Philistine warriors in confrontation with the Egyptians. The vivid battle scene, with soldiers on boats fighting and dying, shows what the Philistines were wearing at the time.
The Philistines were wearing these feathery type of headdress. They wore some sorts of armor, probably not metal, but more likely leather. They carried round shields, and they had long tapering swords.
Goliath, in fact, is described not as a 10th century or 11th or 12th century BC soldier, but as a heavy Greek soldiers of the 7th to 5th centuries BC.
Why is Goliath's outfit about 300 years ahead of its time? Because the people who wrote the account of David and Goliath lived 300 years later. A shard from just after the time of David indicates that there could have been Philistines named Goliath. But the clothing described in the Bible seems to be totally wrong. And what of David himself? Could his details have been similarly retrofitted to make him appear larger than life? And what about the exploits of his famous son, Solomon? Did he really build the first temple, put the Ark of the Covenant there, and take 700 wives? If it was King David who brought the Israelites to Jerusalem, it was his son Solomon who really made the city of David famous. The popular image of Solomon is unique for an ancient king. We know of him as the wise ruler, the builder of the sacred temple. But most of all, we know him for his domestic arrangements as the keeper of 700 wives. Solomon is synonymous with peace, wisdom, wealth, and grandeur. The Bible tells us he built a temple in Jerusalem and filled it with treasures, covering the inner sanctum and the altar with pure gold. His palace was filled with gold relics and his throne inlaid with ivory. He was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. But where are these treasures now? Where are the ruins of his spectacular temple?
We have to admit that there is a sort of contradiction between the biblical account of these two kings and their activities, especially Solomon building so nicely described palaces, the temple itself, etc. And on the other side, we don't have these houses or these palaces found at all. We don't even have the garbage of these palaces. And for palaces, you are looking for objects of prestige. So there's a contradiction between what is written and between what is found.
Did King Solomon and his empire really not leave behind any archaeological footprint?
Archaeologically, whether King Solomon existed, to be fair with you, the answer, if we are strictly speaking about archaeology, the answer should be negative.
But here in Jerusalem, the faithful believe that Solomon built the first temple and that it was razed and then built again and destroyed again. These people anxiously await the time when the third incarnation of the original temple can be built. Inconveniently, where the beautiful Islamic mosque now stands. The temple, more than anything, is Solomon's most lasting legacy, in faith at least. But what about cold, hard stone? The Book of Kings is replete with details of this temple. Dressed masonry with interlaced cedar beams, quarry-dressed stones, elaborate columns, rooms with carved olive wood cherubs, and an inner sanctum made of pure gold.
So we are left with a very full biblical description of a glorious temple, but no physical temple on earth in Jerusalem or even nearby.
Some people have said, according to the description of Solomon's temple, that there's no way it could have existed. It was too lavish, it was too elaborate.
So the argument was that Solomon's temple was merely too magnificent to have been built and decorated in the 10th century. But in 1980, archaeologists were astounded when they found a temple from Solomon's time in Ain Dara, Syria. It proved to be a stunning parallel to Solomon's temple. These ruins were once covered with a mud brick superstructure. Though that is now lost, the facade and interior walls are carved with hundreds of reliefs depicting lions, cherubs, mythical creatures, and ornate geometric designs, just as the Bible says.
The columns were then erected adjacent to the porch of the temple. One to the right, called Jachin, and the other to the left, called Boaz.
Like Solomon's temple, the Ain Dara temple was approached by a courtyard paved with flagstones. And only the bases of the two columns that would have held up the roof of the portico still stand.
What we find is a temple that matches both in ornamentation and in design. We find that there are over 33 features that they share in common. Solomon cannot be credited with building the Ain Dara temple. So we can say that Solomon borrows from the cultural traditions of his region. That the Temple of Solomon is not an outlandish creation of some author's imagination, but actually a temple that fits very nicely within an existing typology that has ornamentation, and that even has a level of wealth that would be very befitting of a typical ancient Near Eastern kingdom from this period.
One could also argue, though, that since the later biblical writers, if they were later, knew what temples from that period looked like, that they're simply describing a temple from a couple centuries from before their time and saying that's what Solomon's temple looked like. Until we actually find Solomon's temple on the Temple Mount, it's going to be hard to say one way or the other.
Not a single artifact from the temple has been found to date. And there may be no stone anywhere in Jerusalem that says, "I am Solomon, and I was here." But there seems to be an explanation for where his fabulous treasure may have gone. Israel was sandwiched between some of the mightiest empires of the time, the Assyrians in the north and the Egyptians to the south. Several Egyptian pharaohs who marched north into Israel recorded their victories in stone. A pharaoh named Sheshonq I invaded his northern neighbor around 925 BC, a few years after Solomon's death. And it's an invasion that the Bible almost certainly recounts as well. Egyptologist Ted Brock takes us to the famous engraving that records Sheshonq's version of the story.
On the outside of the hypostyle hall at Karnak Temple, we have lots of war reliefs from different periods, from Ramesses II down to what's of interest to us here, the triumphal scene of Sheshonq I. And it's of interest in particular because there is some possible correlation between what's commemorated here and the description in the Bible.
According to the Bible, an Egyptian pharaoh called Shishak invaded the Israelite kingdom. Historians and archaeologists agree that Shishak is the Hebrew name for Sheshonq.
Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasure of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything. He also carried away the gold shields which Solomon had made.
The puzzling thing about the relief is there's no mention of Jerusalem among the many cities Sheshonq conquered, but the Bible describes him ransacking the holy city and looting the treasure of Solomon. The relief is so badly damaged that even the prominent image of the king is not preserved. All that's left is a blank space. Perhaps the conquest of Jerusalem was similarly wiped out.
We have to realize that much of the inscription is broken, so perhaps Jerusalem was mentioned in the broken part.
But to some, this explanation seems too convenient.
Jerusalem is not mentioned there, and Judah is not mentioned there, and I have a surprise for you. Not a single town, city, or village in Judah is mentioned in that text.
What it boils down to is that either Shishak didn't attack Jerusalem and Judah in the first place, or that he didn't bother to include them in the inscription. I think he didn't bother to include them in the inscription because Jerusalem and Judah didn't put up a fight.
Fight or no fight, at least we have a plausible explanation for the missing treasure. Shishak took it. But the Pharaoh records other Israelite cities he invaded. Some of these cities, the Bible tells us, belonged to Solomon.
Three of the cities that are mentioned here were excavated, and that is Hatzor in Upper Galilee, Megiddo, and Gezer, which is northwest of Jerusalem.
Is there evidence for Solomon in these cities? Luckily for us, Megiddo is an archaeologist's paradise, a mound that has layer upon layer of ancient cities stretching back some 6,000 years. And among the layers, archaeologists thought they found a city from Solomon's time.
Well, this is the famous Solomonic gate, quote unquote, which for many years one of the symbols of Solomonic grandeur. And this gate was identified with the time of King Solomon because of one verse in the Bible, 1 Kings 9:15, which speaks about construction activity of King Solomon.
And this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised, for to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and Milo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer.
During his reign, Solomon is supposed to have built these sturdy six-chambered gates with a passage between them. Similar gates have been found at Hazor and Gezer. But the dating of these doesn't seem to match Solomon's gates from the Bible.
Few archaeologists, in my opinion, still believe that this is a Solomonic gate. As far as I can judge, most archaeologists today would not take it as a 10th century gate.
These gates and the imperial grandeur that they once denoted almost certainly belonged to Solomon's successors. But are there other layers of civilization in these rich ruins that could belong to the time of Solomon? There is one more place in Megiddo that experts will look for the great king before returning to his Jerusalem. This is Megiddo, one of the most fabled and fought-over pieces of real estate in the world. 34 battles have been fought here. And the book of Revelation tells us that the final battle of Armageddon will take place here. Armageddon literally means Hill of Megiddo. According to the Bible, King Solomon made Megiddo a royal province. But since the city was occupied well before that, archaeologists have discovered multiple levels of civilization here, making it difficult to find traces of Solomon himself. But one verse in the Bible about Solomon's obsession with horses gave archaeologists hope.
And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen, and he has 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he bestowed in the cities for chariots, and with the king at Jerusalem.
The Bible tells us that Solomon built several types of cities, and among them, he says, Arei Rechev, that means cities for the chariots.
If Solomon had so many chariots, he'd have had immense stables to house the horses. Stables whose remains might still exist. And indeed, excavators did find stables. Many stables.
The stables at Megiddo were excavated in the 1920s by the team from the University of Chicago, one of the biggest excavations ever undertaken in the land of Israel. And in the 20s, the excavators made the link between the buildings which were identified as stables and the two verses in the Bible which are not connected. They made the link between the verse speaking about Solomon as a constructor, as a builder at Megiddo, and Solomon as a great horse trader, which city of chariots and horses and so on.
Deborah Cantrell is an archaeologist as well as a horse trader who has worked extensively in Megiddo. She draws parallels between an ancient horse training facility and a modern one in the United States.
This is a training stable, and I believe Megiddo was a training stable because these are performance horses, that they're athletes and they're required to perform every day and learn their job and learn their duty. And at Megiddo, for chariot horses, their duty was to carry the king or to carry the army officers or to fight in battle.
Like its modern equivalent, the stables in Megiddo open directly into the training facility.
One of the most important things about horse training is keeping the horse enclosed. And the training that is put into these animals made them so valuable. Trained chariot horses were the single most expensive commodity in the ancient Near East for over 1,000 years.
Practical evidence like the comparison of the Megiddo structures with modern stables has convinced most archaeologists that these were stables.
I think that the accumulating evidence show that these are indeed stables.
They may be stables, but were they Solomon's?
And when we dig a place like Megiddo, we have more than 20 cities like this, one on top of the other. And the question is, which one of those cities can be attributed to a certain century, to a certain king or a ruler? In our particular subject that we discuss now, the question is, which level at Megiddo can be dated to the time of Solomon, which to the time of his successor?
Even if we know that they are stables, or even if we think that they are, we still don't know who built them. Yes, it might have been Solomon, but it could just as easily have been any one of a number of kings that followed him.
So around the Holy Land and in the inscriptions of his enemies, we see an elusive shadow of the great Solomon, but no hard evidence. But another ruin in Jerusalem has been sparking interest among archaeologists and biblical scholars looking for confirmation of Solomon's building activities.
I'm standing here between two walls which belong to two houses dating back to the 7th century BC, 2,700 years ago. Behind me and there above, you can see a strange structure, stepped large stones.
The massive amount of stones tells archaeologists that this could be the foundation of a large building, a fortress wall, or even a palace.
This is the only candidate, if at all, which might be dragged chronologically into the 10th century. If indeed it was constructed in the 10th century, then historians or Bible scholars happily connected with the activities of David and Solomon in Jerusalem in that particular century.
If the stepstone structure does date to the 10th century BC, then it might have been part of the Milo that Solomon is said to have fortified. Again, we just don't know what the stepstone structure was. There's no sign saying what it was. Just like we have the Tel Dan stele for David, we need an inscription for Solomon, and we don't have that yet.
And without an inscription, these are nothing more than a few questionable blocks of stone, and no definitive sign of this lost king of Israel. David, slayer of Goliath, conqueror of Jerusalem, and father of a line leading to Jesus. Solomon, builder of the first temple, wise beyond words. In Islam, these two are considered prophets as well as kings. They exist in the pages of the holy texts. Will we ever find any direct archaeological evidence for their existence?
When we deal with archaeological data and with reconstruction of ancient texts, we are more often than not dealing with probabilities and not proof.
The archaeologists, the scientists, are trying to ascertain exactly who they were, when they were, and how important they were. But for the faithful, that doesn't really matter.
If they existed or not, it will not change history. I mean, their significance to history, their importance to history exists anyway.
David and Solomon may be so far over the horizon of history that we will never know what they were. Great kings, tribal elders, or heroes compiled from stories handed down over the centuries. Evidence of their existence may not matter one way or another to the faithful now. But if it does turn up, it will matter to all.